Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
When we transform Nebraska corn into ethanol, it doesn't disappear from the food supply. It just takes a little detour. Ethanol is made from the starch. The rest of the corn becomes livestock feed to create meat and dairy products, corn oil, sweetener, and other food ingredients, and maybe a little carbon dioxide to make your soft drinks fizzy. Homegrown ethanol helps satisfy America's hunger for energy and the world's appetite for feed and food. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Roy Smith talks about tracking the dead cat bounce. Justin McMechan explains how hail impacts corn and soybean plants. Nathan Mueller gives recommendations for corn harvest. And Steve Melvin describes how to check irrigation systems for optimum efficiency. Roy Smith is our market analyst this week. The 2017 harvest is starting slower than usual. Across the country, farmers have brought in 4% of their beans, a point off the nation's 5-year average. Growers have also picked 7% of this year's corn crop, 4 points behind normal. This September into October timeframe carries significant weight for a few of Roy's standard marketing practices, such as tracking the dead cat bounce in soybeans after looking for a harvest low. We talked with Roy Wednesday afternoon about where prices stand, but we began by asking for an update on crops in his area of southeast Nebraska.
I think we're about 2 or 3 days from full harvest on soybeans, and corn probably about the same. I haven't been out in the fields, but with the kind of heat that we've had the last couple of weeks, I got to think that corn is getting dry, and you don't want to stand in the middle of the road around here when that happens, because they'll be going everywhere.
Well, give me an update on what you think about the recent movements in either corn or soybean markets.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting to watch, actually. You know, my favorite has been dead cat bounce, and harvest low and dead cat bounce, harvest low, dead cat bounce. And we waited and waited and waited and never got anything that looked like a harvest low or dead cat bounce. And then the response that I would call bearish to the soybean and corn markets both, the soybean market has had a nice rally out of that, what I would call the harvest low. The corn market's kind of dead in the water, but I think that relates to the supplies of old crop corn that are still available. So, you know, you kind of, I guess you look at your cash flow and you look at your inventory and look at the markets and what have they done. Well, the soybean market has gone, I call it dramatically higher, because we're about 60 or 70 cents off the harvest low. The corn market's kind of dead in the water, but we probably have to wait till we get some of that inventory out of the system before that's going to do very much.
Can you explain why this is maybe a little bit odder this year, in that the harvest low is coming seemingly before harvest really gets going?
Well, the thing you have to think about that harvest low concept is that some years it'll be right on October 1st. A lot of years it'll be off just a little bit. Like this year, it looks like it was about 10 days ago, or 8 or 10. 3 or 4 years back, we had a kind of a up and down 3 or 4 times before it actually got serious. And so you never know exactly where it's going to be, and that's what makes it so frustrating.
But it's serious enough that you think you'd be willing to pull the trigger if you brought beans in out of the field at this price?
Absolutely. You know, you develop your strategies based on the chart patterns, and if you don't act on those, you're really foolish, because the market's giving you right now, according to my calculations yesterday, 61 cents a bushel over the harvest low. well, you only got to go up 39 more cents and you got the full-blown dead cat bounce. So make your decision and act accordingly.
Meanwhile, in corn, what are your hopes for where prices might be able to go?
I guess considering what has happened in the corn market here the last 6 to 10 months, I'd be looking more at where is the market going to be around the 1st of April. I mean, year in and year out, selling corn the 1st of April has been a good strategy. If you don't get a price that you like, you got to do something, because if you don't do anything, the market may do what it did last year, and that is go straight in the tank after you get past 1st of October.
You got into a position where you are still left with some old crop corn and now trying to develop a marketing strategy for that and this new crop. What would you do?
Well, there's a spread that you can use that will help take away some of the pain on that, and that is the old crop. Let's say it's October now, or almost October, and you go out to May and you get a spread that shows the October lower than the May, so sell the May and put the October in the bin. Now that requires some management. It's not going to be the easiest thing in the world, and it may not be what I would call super profitable.
Yeah.
So, you know, you look at what the alternatives are, and there really aren't any very good ones.
One final question to deal with these USDA reports that have caused so much concern among analysts and farmers, I think. How would you recommend farmers deal with these, either in the future or to try and get around that stress?
Well, given the fact that farmers really have distrust in the markets, if you're in that category, then instead of putting it in the bin, sell it. I mean, I've watched the market on TV many nights, and there's a guy on there who is fond of saying, well, just sell something. You know, pretty simple, just sell something. Well, it's hard to do when the market's below your cost of production, but it's not any harder to do than it is to keep selling that stuff ahead, and you sell it ahead, and you may pick up a few pennies on the spread, or you may not, but at least you've gotten rid of it, and you've got an empty bin there to put this year's crop in.
Next week, Mike Briggs will join us to look at cattle markets. Researchers at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln are trying to learn more about how hail affects young plants during the growing season. Hail damage can cause significant economic losses for producers of corn, soybeans, wheat, and other crops. In 2016, hail was responsible for 35% of total crop insurance indemnity payments in Nebraska. That's according to USDA Risk Management Agency data analyzed by UNL Ag Econ Assistant Professor Corey Walters. The portion was slightly lower the previous year at 27%, but according to a USDA report released this week, the share across the country was much smaller at only 11% in 2016 and even lower at 7% for the U.S. from 2001 to 2015. Justin McMechan is part of a Nebraska Extension team studying plant survivability by using a hail machine to injure and track the growth of corn and soybeans. We talked with Justin at a soybean management field day earlier this summer and began by asking when hail events are most likely to occur in Nebraska.
You know, about a third of all hail events that we get during the growing season occur during, roughly the early half of the growing season, when there's a lot of options for replants. And so it's an important time of the year. And if we look at a map of hail days in the United States over the course of a year, we get greater than 7 hail days a year in Nebraska. And so that's 1-inch size hail or greater within 25 miles of a location. So unfortunately, a lot of growers in our state do experience hail.
If growers have attended one of the events at NREC, they might have seen you with your hail machine. Tell me what that is and why you have it.
Yeah, so not something you typically hear about, but we do have a simulated hail machine. It was actually created or just recently built here in 2016 and 2017 from a machine that was built in 1986 called a Hail Razor. And so we've deemed ours the Hail Razor 2.0, a upgraded version. And the reason we deemed it 2.0 is the 1986 hail machine was really a demonstration machine. So it propelled ice at 170 miles per hour, was great for showing the impacts of hail damage, but we really needed the research components, the parameters behind it, to properly study the impacts on both early and late season hail damage to both corn and soybeans. So this new machine takes into account wind speed using a pitot-static tube, which you find on an airplane, so yeah, speeds are pretty fast. And then we also have an optical RPM sensor that measures the rotation of an auger that feeds in the ice into that wind vane. And so this gives us a lot of parameters in the field that we can use and put over those plots to know we're doing the same thing each time. So it really is a unique machine in its capability to create these consistent hail events.
At today's event, you showed pictures of plants and asked growers to decide whether or not they were still alive or whether they would survive. Why is that decision so hard?
Yeah, because it's complicated. So what I showed was really a unifoliate stage soybean plant and different levels of defoliation. And so I showed the unifoliate leaves missing and the cotyledonary storage organs missing. And then I also showed nodes cut off, so missing those unifoliates as well as missing the cotyledonary nodes. And when we actually just got to a totally defoliated plant and nodes were present, growing points were present, growers were saying, well, those plants look dead to me. And so that was an important take-home point, is as long as there's a viable growing point, you can still get a full plant out of that. They'll often have a very different structure. If a grower did receive hail earlier this year and they go out to those soybean fields, they may see two stems that come out directly from the bottom of that plant. But you know, it's important that they take that consideration and wait to make it, because I did tell them that even though both nodes are present, those may not be viable plants. And the issue with that is that it's stem breakage. The plant will still be upright, but it's been essentially broken off and all the vascular tissue's been destroyed. Those plants will not recover, but it's going to take 7 days to really be comfortable in making that estimation. So that's why we tell them to wait.
Later on in the season, what kind of challenges can arrive when it comes with disease?
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges, early season and late. For corn, the early season considerations are really bacterial pathogens that we worry about. We tackled this in 2014 looking at Gauss's wilt, and we didn't try and mediate the problem. We used resistant and susceptible varieties to look at that, but they're so heavily damaged from the hail event, we just didn't see a response, resistant or susceptible. But what our goal was, more or less, was to say to a grower, okay, if a bacterial pathogen was present, at what point following that hail event, could you say, oh, I know it's here and now it's part of my evaluation method? And so we were trying to determine that. For soybeans, a little more complicated. There are some bacterial pathogens that are in soybeans, but we get a lot of recommendations or situations from growers where they ask, well, should I apply a fungicide? And fungal pathogens are really not a component in hail damage. Bacterial pathogens are. And there have been studies that have been done in 2016 by Sisson that looked at basically, should we apply a fungicide at R3 if we receive hail at R1 or R4, prior to the hail event or afterwards. And they didn't see an economic yield response from that. Slight bump in yield, but 1.5 bushels, but not enough to pay off.
Overall, do you think when it comes to assessing hail damage and trying to decide whether or not to replant, are we learning more? Do we know more than we knew 5 years ago or so? We
are learning a lot, and that machine I talked about earlier really represents a new phase for us in hail damage and better understanding it. Our 2015 study that we ran was looking at variation in plant damage. So plants are alive, but they, some may be cut off at ground level as a result of hail. Others are, just leaf damage. And that variation in the canopy, we're trying to understand that as situations get more complicated in replants. We're comparing that to traditional methods that NCIS is using. And so we're really on the verge of utilizing technologies as well, like drones and UAVs, to get a really objective evaluation to hail damage. That's something I think that growers as well as the National Crop Insurance Service support. It's just a matter of getting something that's economically viable for both parties.
During the growing season, you can find more resources about evaluating hail damage in corn or soybeans on the CropWatch website. Nebraska farmers are just getting started with the 2017 corn harvest. The latest report from the state's National Agricultural Statistics Service showed growers had picked 2% of this year's crop. That's 5 points behind their normal pace. NASS listed 37% of Nebraska corn as mature, a jump of 19 points from a week ago. In our previous episode of Market Journal, Nebraska Extension cropping systems educator Nathan Mueller explained how growers could optimize soybean harvest. This week, we look at getting the best results from corn. We started our conversation by asking how different the two crops were as they approached the end of the season.
Corn is just a completely different plant in terms of moisture. A lot of times I've seen a lot of pictures on Twitter, people saying they're just waiting for the corn to dry down. So a lot of times we're dealing with having too much moisture, not excessively dry like we are with soybeans.
Before we talk about some of those harvest things, let's talk about potential loss and what you want to do in the field before harvest starts to make sure that you're not going to have any major lodging problems.
Yeah, so you know, a lot of things happen during the season, from hail to moisture stress, nitrogen or deficiencies that really can impact diseases, that can really impact the stock quality. And so you really do need to actually walk in all your fields and scout them to know what you're dealing with in terms of stock quality, because the worst thing is to get to a field and be surprised once you get past the end rows that there's a lot of down corn. And if we can prioritize those fields and get to those fields sooner, that can be a big help, because that's where the most of the loss we're concerned about is just corn on the ground. And then we have to deal with volunteer corn too next year.
When you're doing pinch or push tests, are there certain thresholds where you start to get nervous and say, I'll target this field
Yeah,
first?
you know, personally I like the push test just because I don't have to bend over and squeeze that lower internodes with the pinch test. You know, you're just pushing it 30%. If you start 30% over, if you start to get 10% of the plants having issues and not pop back or bounce back and hit you in the face, you know, that's a concern to try to get those fields harvested early. You know, the biggest concern is to look at on-farm storage. Do you have enough drying capacity? If you're having some corn going down and you're still at higher, above 20%, 20% is kind of the cutoff to stick corn in a natural airflow bin. So it's important to look at on-farm capacity, because at the same time you don't want to be hauling in high moisture corn and getting the dock either.
So let's talk about dry down in the field. Do certain hybrids dry down differently?
Yeah, they really do. You know, part of that's just the maturity. We know fuller season corn is going to be higher moisture. That's pretty consistent, but there is some variation even within the same maturity. Let's say 214-day hybrids. Some just dry down a little bit faster after you reach black layer. So that's something really to talk to your seed dealer about, to know which hybrids have that trait that might be a few points moisture lower than another one.
Is there a rule of thumb on how much corn might dry down during a day?
It really does depend. You can easily pick up a drop in a moisture of 1%. It's not as drastic as we see with soybeans in a day, but it's something to check on. If you can hand shell some corn and test it. Now, getting a representative moisture sample is hard, but to kind of follow things through the harvest.
You said farmers might be able to use Useful to Usable. That's an online tool to help them. How so?
Yeah, the U2U, a growing degree unit tool, is on the High Plains Regional Climate Center now. It is a way to plug in your planting date and your maturity to look at when those hybrids are going to reach black layer maturity, obviously dry down after that. But that will help you figure out. So if I planted on April 22nd, 114-day hybrid, I planted a 110-day hybrid on May 14th, what's that look like? That's actually only a week apart in terms of reaching black layer. That's like September 17th versus September 24th. So it gives you an idea, again, that you can do before even scouting to get an idea of where fields are at in terms of when they're going to reach maturity.
One final question on storage. Is there a certain moisture level where you get nervous about putting it in the bin too soon or too wet?
Yeah, so you know, a lot of people are looking at high moisture corn on the beef side, but in terms of storing it in the bin, 20% is kind of the cutoff between, you know, having to dry that with temperature versus natural airflow. So, and then of course we need to make sure we're watching those bins and the conditions outside after.
You can find more information about preparing for soybean harvest by watching Nathan's interview in last week's episode of Market Journal. That program also contains an interview with Nebraska Extension's Rick Rasby on the benefit of grazing corn stalks after harvest. If there's downtime before harvest, the end of the 2017 growing year could be an opportunity for farmers to make sure their irrigation systems are running at peak efficiency. Nebraska Extension's Steve Melvin says producers should look at operating pressure, flow, and the performance of their sprinkler packages to see if any improvements can be made. We talked with Steve at last week's Husker Harvest Days and asked why it could be beneficial to take one last look at pivots before shutting down for the off-season.
Right now makes a great time because you not only can still run the pivot, go out and start it up again and take a look at it and see how things are working, but you can also look at the crop that was irrigated this summer.
So operating pressure, you say, is one of the first things you should look at. Tell me what you should do.
A lot of times pressure gauges don't last real well, and so it's good to make sure the pressure gauge is working. If it's not, get a new one and put on it and take a look at the pressure. If the pressure is correct, the system's working correct. If it's not, it doesn't exactly tell you what's wrong with the system, but it gives you an indication you need to look. Flow meters, if you have those, are also an important thing to look at, but pressure is certainly the most important.
Are there any guidelines for positioning the system when you test that?
No, just start it up in some place where you can run it and take a look at it. Visually, you can look at the sprinkler pattern coming out of it if it's above the canopy of the crop, and then it's kind of nice to have the sun kind of in the foreground of your pivot and get kind of that gleam off the water, and you can really get a good look at the sprinkler, and it should be a nice uniform pattern, getting from more at the outside edge to a little less as you come inside.
So looking at pressure and flow doesn't matter if it's uphill or downhill or, you know, completely level land?
If you've got pressure regulators on it, which most systems do anymore, it really shouldn't matter if it's uphill or downhill. You should have the correct pressure at the nozzle. Now that's assuming you've got the correct pressure at the pivot point. And if it's too low, then you may, if you've got the pivot uphill, you may see that you run out of pressure towards the out end. And if you've got that situation, it's always good to check the pressure at the out end when it's on the highest point of the field.
Anything on the pump that you should be checking, or any quick fixes that might be there if you do notice some problems?
Well, most guys, are not probably going to do their own pump work, but if there's a problem, try to figure out what's going on. You may want to get your pump guy to come look, but did the pressure, the pressure drop because of excess flow, because there's leaks or something like that? Is the water level dropped off, and so you really need to change something with the pump, or is the pump worn out, or need replaced? So there's lots of things you might find with why the pressure would be low, and the pump could certainly be one of them.
Sprinklers?
Sprinklers are really where the rubber meets the road. And so you want to make sure they're working correctly. Again, take a quick look at them and see if they're working right. About 10 years, 10,000 hours, something in that range is when you need to start looking at replacing them under a normal situation and make sure they're working right. There's some new innovative sprinklers out there that may be better than the ones that are on the system and may be worth updating just for the newer technology.
If you're waiting around until you bring the combine out, can you rely on something like a yield monitor to try and find problems from irrigation systems?
Not typically. Typically, you might see it from an aerial photo or something where you can see some rings out there in the field. They're going to match up the direction the pivot turns around the field. But typically with a yield monitor, you're harvesting some areas that are good and some that aren't good, and it'll usually average it out. And so if it's got to be a very major problem to see it with a yield monitor on a combine.
Some of these problems, Steve, not necessarily a financial number here, but how big of a problem can they be for an operation?
Well, sprinkler packages aren't that expensive in the scheme of things compared to the energy it takes to pump water. And so, a lot of times the economics come in very well to taking a look at replacing the sprinkler package. And, they last about a third as long as the center pivot. And so, you really need to, just because the pivot isn't worn out, certainly the sprinkler package can be.
You can find more information about checking irrigation systems in Steve's recent Crop Watch article. We'll link to that on the Market Journal website. Now, with this week's weather forecast and an outlook for the potential of La Niña conditions, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. And before we get to the main forecast, during this last week we dealt with some fairly warm temperatures with a couple cold fronts that moved through, cool conditions off. And now we're dealing with this big upper air trough that is going to be moving into the region, and it's going to bring us some pretty significant rainfall by all accounts as we go through this weekend. Now, before we get to the main forecast, we want to bring you up to date on the latest ENSO event in the equatorial Pacific. This is our El Nino Southern Oscillation region. This is where we look for El Nino, La Nina development. And we are starting to see some changes that are starting to occur, and we want to bring you up to date on those because they do have implications for our winter precipitation. So let's take a look at the current equatorial Pacific region. You'll notice this cold pocket of water here. These are below normal sea surface temperatures running between 1 and 3 degrees below normal in the eastern equatorial Pacific, around an average of 1 degree below normal in the central equatorial Pacific. Below the surface, we're running approximately 200 to 250 meters of below normal sea surface conditions, and up to departures up to about 6 degrees below normal. And this is actually funneling all the way into the eastern equatorial Pacific, coming to the surface, and that's why we're seeing the intensity right here in the eastern equatorial region. We'll also notice that we have some warm conditions in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Basin, and we've seen an active hurricane season. Typically, La Nina conditions will portend to an active hurricane season. In the wintertime, we would expect above normal moisture 70% or greater of the time in the Pacific Northwest, the Eastern Corn Belt, with below normal precipitation across the southern United States. And we also see below normal conditions across temperatures across much of the Dakotas. So as we look at today's upper air charts, what we do have is a very intense upper air low pressure system, this big trough that is going to slowly migrate eastward, deep vetch of moisture up in advance of this, low pressure to The Colorado, southeast Colorado region is going to pump that moisture up into our region, and so we expect to see a big line of showers and isolated thunderstorms develop, slowly moving eastward as we go into tomorrow, starting to impact more of central and eastern Nebraska. We still see that low down the Texas Panhandle. Slow moving will generate additional moisture feed toward the north, and widespread precipitation with some heavy amounts likely across portions of central and north central Nebraska. Then on Monday, this system starts to progress toward eastern Nebraska. We see high pressure behind it. That's cool high pressure, but in front of it, the deep moisture feed will continue, and therefore we would expect to see the major precipitation shift from central into eastern Nebraska and points up toward the north. And then as we get into Tuesday, we start to see this trough weakening somewhat. The low pressure system associated with this trough will move up into southern Wisconsin. That will take the vast majority of the precipitation to the east of us. There is some lingering showers expected across southeast Nebraska during the first half of the day. And then this upper air trough starts to really fall apart as we get into Wednesday. High pressure dominates much of the central plains through the southeastern United States, and so most of the precipitation will be formed well to our east and to our south, as we do have a little impulse movement across the southern plains. Now as we go into Thursday, we see this trough starting to make its way toward the Great Lakes, and we see big high pressure ridge starting to build in. Does show a surface low up in northwestern Iowa, but most of the moisture is going to be well to the east of this low pressure system, basically from the southern plains region all the way up into the Ohio River Valley. Dry conditions in the central plains, and this high pressure ridge starts to build in toward the end of next week, bringing us back to more normal like temperatures with high pressure and control. And it appears as we go even farther down the road that dry conditions are going to be the story of the day as we start to see the precipitation shifting off toward the southeast on Friday. As we go into next week and then following week, we're looking at below normal temperatures from next Thursday through the following Tuesday. To our south, to our northwest, we're looking at above normal temperatures, and this is a story of the day as we start to see the precipitation stay to the south, dry conditions in our region, and this continues at least to October the 7th.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean prices, the effect of hail on young plants, corn harvest recommendations, and irrigation management. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Next week, Mike Briggs will be our cattle market analyst, and Brent Gloy will talk about farm real estate values compared to income. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.